Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because, well, we're tackling a subject that is literally reshaping an entire industry right now. We're going to systematically break down India's complex new maritime liability landscape. Look, if you're operating in, advising on, or drafting contracts for the maritime sector, the ground beneath your feet has fundamentally shifted. We're talking about billions of dollars in commercial contracts that are currently totally misaligned with this new reality, which exposes parties to massive, unforeseen financial risks. So today, we're going to unpack exactly what those shifts are, how they work, and most importantly, how they impact your day-to-day commercial operations. We're going straight to the source material to give you the clear, structured, and in-depth understanding you really need.
First things first, we need to clear the air and dispel a massive industry myth right off the bat. If you've been hearing people panicking about the quote-unquote 2026 Green Maritime Regulations, I need you to know right now, that document simply doesn't exist. There is no single statute by that name. No way. The rumor actually stems from a kind of messy conflation of local Indian policy goals being blended with upcoming global IMO targets. What actually changed this is huge, because India just rewrote its entire ports law for the first time since 1908. We have to name it correctly, because understanding this specific act is the foundation of everything we're going to cover today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today we'll be covering 1. The big distinction between two types of liability. 2. The Indian Ports Act 2025, which is our binding core. 3. Distinguishing policy from law. 4. Future global carbon liabilities. And finally 5. Drafting better environmental clauses. Starting off with Section 1, the big distinction between two types of liability.
To really grasp this complex web, we're going to build our understanding like a layer cake, starting right at the foundational layer. Because before we touch a single legal clause, we've got to establish a crucial difference that commercial parties conflate far too often. Basically, there are two totally different kinds of liability. First up, we have statutory liability. This is what a ship owner or port operator owes the state for breaching a pollution regulation. It's fixed by law, and you absolutely cannot contract your way out of it. If your vessel leaks oil in a port, the state is going to fine the ship owner directly under statutory liability. You can't just tell the government to go after your charterer instead, right? Then we have contractual liability. An environmental liability clause in a charter party doesn't change what the state can fine you. Contractual liability just dictates how the cost of that statutory breach, or really the cost of general environmental compliance, gets allocated between commercial parties. So going back to that oil leak example, your charter party agreement can dictate that the charterer must ultimately reimburse you for that exact fine. You can't contract out of the state's penalty. You can only decide who ultimately pays the bill.
Moving on to Section 2, the Indian Ports Act 2025, our binding core.
Building our next layer, let's look at the hard law itself. The Indian Ports Act 2025 completely replaces that colonial-era 1908 Act, and for the very first time, it makes environmental compliance a mandatory structural requirement. It's no longer just an afterthought. Let's look at the operational reality of these core obligations. First, every port must strictly comply with MARPOL and the Ballast Water Management Convention. Period. Second, we've got mandatory port waste reception and handling plans. Practically speaking, this means every single port has to provide adequate reception facilities for vessel-generated waste. Ships pulling into port now face mandatory offloading protocols and specific tariff structures they're legally obligated to pay. Third, ports have to have mandatory pollution control plans that are subject to periodic central government audits. This creates some serious top-down oversight. And finally, Section 52 penalties. When you read this together with the Merchant Shipping Act of 1958, it gives port authorities real teeth, creating an enforceable penalty regime with direct legal obligations on port operators and vessel owners.
Now, what's really interesting about this next operational shift is the concept of decriminalization. Under the old 1908 Act, certain environmental breaches risked a full-blown criminal trial. The 2025 Act converts these into monetary penalties instead, which are adjudicated directly by a port conservator. On its face, you might think, oh, making the penalty a fine softens the regime, but actually the reality is the exact opposite. Think about the burden of proof in a criminal trial. Proving environmental negligence beyond a reasonable doubt takes years. It requires endless expert testimonies, and it gets bogged down by procedural motions. It's a mess. But by turning a crime into an administrative financial penalty, the port conservator simply looks at the breach and issues the fine immediately. It completely removes the massive delays of the criminal court system. For the industry, this is huge. It means enforcement is drastically swifter, and your commercial liability actually becomes much more predictable for financial planning.
All right, Section 3, distinguishing policy from law.
Now we shift our focus to the outer layers of our cake, looking at the non-binding frameworks that run parallel to the actual statutes. Running alongside the Ports Act is the National Green Shipping Policy, which is built on 7 key pillars: green ships, alternative fuels like green hydrogen, sustainable ship recycling, green ports, eco-technologies, green financing, and workforce capacity building. Along with the Haridsagar Green Port Guidelines, these are absolutely vital to understand. But there's a very deliberate reason that government issues policies instead of laws for these pillars. These represent the direction of travel for the industry. Policies are tools designed to build industry capacity, advance technology, and lay down infrastructure before the government eventually brings down the hammer with strict legal mandates. So you absolutely must not confuse these aspirational targets with the penal, enforceable nature of the Ports Act itself.
So what does this all mean? Why do these policies even matter if they aren't strict laws? Well, because they provide the financial lifeblood for modernization. To put it simply, the government is currently offering between 25 and 30% in financial assistance for the construction of specialized vessels like green tugs or hybrid ferries. Now, leveraging these funds definitely requires navigating some specific bureaucratic procurement frameworks and meeting local build requirements, but it is a massive incentive. Think of it this way. The Ports Act provides the stick, but these policies provide a very substantial 25 to 30% carrot to help the maritime industry upgrade its fleet way ahead of those future mandates.
Let's move on to Section 4, Future Global Carbon Liabilities.
Let's step back for a second and look at the global layer, because this is where we need to issue a strict, honest warning to the industry about overselling upcoming regulations. If you're hearing pitches out there that ship owners face binding global carbon pricing liability right now under the IMO framework, you really need to understand the geopolitical reality behind this timeline. Here's the deal. The IMO's net zero framework was agreed in principle in April 2025. It was supposed to be formally adopted in October 2025, but it didn't pass. There's an ongoing fierce debate over the exact mechanism, specifically whether to implement a global fuel standard or a universal carbon levy. Under significant pressure from the United States, who really wanted more time to study the macroeconomic impacts of a universal levy on global trade, a motion to adjourn the vote by a full year succeeded. So, the vote is now rescheduled for October 2026. Because of the mandatory ratification periods, this means the earliest possible entry into force is March 2028. This global carbon pricing mechanism is not current binding law. Ship owners are not yet exposed to this as an enforceable obligation, and honestly, blending what is legally binding now in India with what is delayed globally until 2028 is a recipe for terrible commercial advice.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Drafting Better Environmental Clauses.
So how do we bring all this in-depth knowledge home? By taking our foundational layer of the law and applying it to the top layer of practical drafting. And this brilliantly illustrates your definitive drafting checklist for charter parties and port service agreements. Number 1, compliance cost. Your contracts absolutely must explicitly allocate who pays the new mandatory tariff structures for MARPOL-compliant waste disposal at Indian ports. Number 2, statutory penalty exposure. If a swift Section 52 monetary penalty is issued by a port conservator, your contract has to clearly detail whether the shipowner absorbs it or if there's a strict indemnification clause pushing it back to the charterer whose conduct actually caused the breach. Number 3, audit cooperation. With ports now subjected to central government audits, a massive new risk emerges. Look, without an explicit audit cooperation clause, your vessel could literally be detained in port just because a charterer refuses to hand over acquired emissions data to the authorities. Your contract must mandate data sharing. And number 4, forward-looking carbon. Even though that IMO framework is delayed, well-drafted long-term contracts are including contingent clauses right now. You have to address who bears the cost if and when it takes effect in 2028, just so you aren't left holding the bag.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground today. You've seen the hard law of the 2025 Ports Act, you understand why decriminalization leads to swifter administrative enforcement, you get the critical difference between statutory and contractual liability, and we've unpacked the complex geopolitical delays behind those global carbon frameworks. The reality is, India's statutory framework has moved incredibly fast, fundamentally altering your operational and financial risk. So I want to leave you with this critical question to think about. Have your existing charter party templates actually caught up to this new reality? Or are you still operating on contracts drafted for a 1908 world? It might be time to take a very close look at your clauses. Keep learning, keep refining, and I'll see you in the next explainer.